everybody, and welcome to another episode of What's on Your Mind. I'm your host, Nimade Belu, or That African Butterfly, as I'm known on social media. I am very excited today. I have a wonderful guest with me, Dr. Lexx Brown-James, and we are talking about a very serious and important topic. This month is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. So she's joining me to just have a little bit more conversation about that topic and the trauma around that. She is a PhD level sex educator and licensed marriage and family therapist. She owns the Institute for Sexuality and Intimacy, where she provides therapy and education using the hashtag shame-free sex ed. And she really does focus on helping to reduce sexual shame and help couples increase their intimacy. So I'm so excited. Thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Lexx Brown-James.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm super excited about this conversation.
Absolutely. And was there anything that I forgot in your intro, anything that you'd like to share with everybody to introduce yourself a little?
No, I can always do that. So some things you should know about me is that Dr. Lexx is my name. She, her, doctor, my pronouns. You can call me Lexx. It's fine. I just have to slide credentials across the table occasionally for people. I am a Southerner who's trapped in the North. So I live in Philadelphia, right outside of Philly, on Lenape people's land. But I am from College Park, Atlanta, Georgia. So if you've ever heard a rap song out of the South, that is my neighborhood that I grew up in, and very proud of it. And I love helping people from womb to tomb learn about sexuality and education that's appropriate and right for them.
Yes, and we're so happy to have you here with us to share some of your knowledge. Just to kick it off, so you're a certified sex educator, and you do a lot around helping couples and helping people learn, which I think is especially important. How do you incorporate sexual education into discussions about sexual assault prevention and awareness?
Absolutely. So I have a lot of credentials behind my name to say I talk about sexuality a lot, but a lot of people get stuck on just those first three letters of sex, sex, and only think intercourse. They don't think about the full body, the full mind, the full spirit that goes with sexuality. And so a lot of times I have to educate people on what actual assault is. It's not solely just specifically rape, for example. It's not solely just specifically this kind of dark stranger in an alley. And people oftentimes don't know the different varieties of assault. They just feel violated and icky, but they don't know that actually, no, this violation and boundary violation is assault. And we can call it that if that's what it feels like to you. We don't have to label it, but I'm saying that this fits the definition. And it's okay if that fits your definition. And it doesn't necessarily have to define who you are. And so I do a lot of teaching around what assault is, what happens with it, and that you're not broken, damaged, or not valuable because of it.
That's really important. I do notice that, like you said, a lot of people get hung up on the sex word of the conversation. Even when we talk about, younger people and how old they should learn and things like that, they just hear that word and they're like, oh, they're too young. But I think that knowledge is really important. And like you said, it's not just necessarily the dark person or the dark alleyway, the random person. It's often people that and sometimes even relationships. What is like the role of consent and consent education in preventing sexual assault and promoting more healthy relationships?
Oh my gosh. Such a big question. And so I told you from womb to tomb, right? And something else you should know about me is I'm a parent. I have three loving gems. And when they are on my nerves, they are the hating ass babies, Habs. So that's copyright and trademark, but use it as you will by me. But we started consent education very early in our household. So not around health and hygiene issues. If you need to get your vaccines, if you need to change your diaper, you don't really consent to that. I'm changing your diaper, right? It's health and hygiene. You don't get to consent to wearing your car seatbelt, safety. But you do get to consent if you want hugs from mom, dad, grandma. To say like, nope, I have a right to say who's in my space and who's in my body. Even down to tickling. So my almost 2-year-old, I will tickle and then I'll pause. And they tell me more. They're like, more, mom, more. And then we'll tickle again because that brings safety and trust in a relationship. When somebody says, you can hear me and you actually listen to what I want to happen with my body, again, within safety realms, there's no one that doesn't benefit from that. Somebody's teaching boundaries, and another person is showing, I respect your boundaries. I respect you. I care about you. And that trickles all the way up to elders, right? Elders in care, elders in relationships, and the middle of those adults too, of saying, like, ew, I don't like it when you touch me like that. Don't do that. How am I going to keep trusting you with my body if you're going to keep doing stuff I don't like?
Mm-hmm.
You're putting your
Yeah.
needs above mine. And that means I can't trust you with my pleasure. It means I can't trust you with my body, which means ultimately I can't trust our relationship.
And I think that it's so great that you mentioned like the womb to tomb with the consent too, because people don't, I think of it often in that way that like, even like you said, tickling, hugging, like that's something that like the kids' body is their body, and teaching them body autonomy is so important, especially at a young age. Not
Mhm.
that you would think that anyone they know would do anything that hurts them, but there is something to be said, to be raised to quiet that voice and let an adult voice always be superior to what it
Mhm.
is your body wants and needs. So, you know, your parent, even something as simple as your parents saying, like, you have to give that person a hug, like they don't. And it's
Mm-mm.
actually important. And that adult's feelings are not more important than the child feeling. A, like it's okay to say no, and B, like their parent has their back if they
Mhm.
were to say no, because then later on when something happens, they're more likely to trust in their own voice and also feel okay trusting with their parents.
Right. If they can tell me no, somebody that they love and they care for, they can tell a stranger no. They can
Mm-hmm.
tell an older kid no. Because
Yeah.
people always think of only adults and older people. And we know that most sexuality assault, especially towards children, is from somebody that they know.
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't start with, let me just go for your genitals. It starts with light touches. It starts with getting close to your body. It starts with, well, I'm going to sit right next to you and put my hand around you. Isn't hugs nice?
Mm-hmm.
Right. It starts with these very simplistic, insidious, strategically placed
Mm-hmm.
beginnings. And it also says, well, you listen to adults. If you don't listen to adults, you're in trouble. There's going to be a punishment, a consequence. And so when we lead with that shaming, you're bad, you're wrong, it becomes easy to manipulate. And
No,
sometimes that's what's used, unfortunately.
yeah, you're absolutely right. Now, would that be under, because a word I think that we hear a lot that people don't always necessarily know what it means is grooming.
Hmm.
And sometimes grooming is insidious and sometimes it's not. But can you speak a little bit more about like exactly what grooming is?
Yeah, it is. People have been using the term as a weaponization for things they're uncomfortable with, or be like, I've been called a groomer because I educate people about sexuality education, right? So they're like, oh, you're grooming kids. No, grooming kids is specifically seeking out a relationship with a child for the goal of having some type of sexual action with them.
Mm-hmm.
That is what grooming is. It is on purpose. And entire families get groomed. It's typically not just the one person. The adults get groomed thinking that they can trust this person, thinking
Mm-hmm.
that this person can be around their kid, thinking about this other child can be around their child. And then it starts to move into, I'm trying to get my goal of being whatever sexual with this child. And that is what specifically grooming is. And it looks different based on the person, but oftentimes it's nobody really knows, right? Nobody's like, yes, come in and hurt my child. Most people aren't. Come in and hurt my child. They're like, I trusted you. I thought you were okay. I didn't think that this person was capable of this. And so that's why I say grooming is insidious, because you think they're a friend. You know that they're a family member. They care about you. They care about your kids. So they would never hurt them in this way. And that's when we end up having these things, because we don't teach kids body part names, which we know saying you can't touch my cookie is very different than saying you can't touch my vulva. And I
Mm-hmm.
love that people are saying, I want to teach them a name so they can report.
Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. I love it. I want to teach the name so we can prevent.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I'll give a quick example. My kids use the vulva, penis, anus, right? And butt. We say butt. One of my kids said, oh no, I got to get a shot in my tushy. Red flag. Who taught you tushy?
Mm-hmm.
That's not a word we use in our house. Who has been talking to you about genitals and private regions?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, so I know we don't use that word. I don't want them to be scared. So mom's coming real hot and heavy because I already got red flags up, right? And
Right.
I'm like, hey, let me lead with curiosity. You use the word tushy. What does that word mean? Mom, that's another word for butt. It is? Where did you guys learn that? I
Mm-hmm.
learned it from a YouTube, whatever channel they were watching, a kids channel. Oh, okay.
Okay,
That's
yeah.
where you learn that term. And this is an appropriate channel for you to watch. I got it.
Mm,
Thanks. But now I
yeah.
know another kid wasn't talking to them about their body parts, or another
Mm,
adult wasn't.
yeah. Which is, I mean, I never even thought about it until that moment, which is true because there are so many people. Listen, once I left a comment about why you should use proper terms for kids on something on Instagram, I got raked over the coals in the comment section. But it's the truth, though. And it's always people
Mhm.
who have opinions who haven't studied the facts of it. And the facts of it are teaching kids the proper terms is a form of prevention.
Mhm.
And like you said, though, even from that angle of if you've only taught them the proper words, once someone starts teaching them the other words, it gives you an entrance to have the conversation of, hey, where did you learn that? I think that
Exactly.
that's great, and people probably don't even think about it that way.
Mm-mm.
And thank you everybody who's tuning in. We have a few comments. I don't want to let them all go. Thank you, God Bride, Monica, and Izzy, and Amy for tuning in. Amy said it's a great conversation. Izzy said it's a much needed conversation. It is, absolutely. God Bride said, nice approach, Dr. Lex. I agree with you. It absolutely is. Um, so we know that it has an impact, obviously. There's no way that, some form of sexual assault or sexual abuse can't. But when we speak, since we're on the topic of kids, like, what are some of the um, long-term mental health impacts of childhood sexual abuse?
So I want to be very clear that for some people, the things that we would term as abuse, they don't term them as abuse, and they don't see themselves as victimized.
Mm,
Right? So for some folks, a sexual exploration with a cousin that maybe there was an age gap difference, they don't see themselves as abused. They don't see themselves as survivors.
mm,
And so it is not my job as a therapist to make them.
right.
Right? So for those folks, they're like, yeah, this happened and I'm fine with it. It was kind of weird, but I'm fine. For other people, right, there can be a lifelong and need for support, for healing, to say, like, hey, this was uncomfortable for me. I feel changed. And sometimes that needs extra support. One, the best thing we can do is always believe people. When they tell you something happened, believe them. That doesn't mean you have to go fly off the handle right then. That doesn't mean you have to go to jail. It means you center that person's feelings and what they need first. Do they need medical care? Do they need safety away from this person? Do they need to report to someone else? Your feelings are not the feelings that need to be centered there. That
Mm,
person, that child's feelings are the feelings that need to be centered. Same if you're in relationship with somebody who's a survivor of assault, right? Might mean when you're in sexual intercourse, they can have flashbacks. That doesn't mean you keep going and they're going to grin and bear it. Even if they say, no, keep going, it's okay. And you can tell they're in duress and distress.
mm,
You don't keep going. You stop and you center what they need. And for some reason, we're not always good at decentering ourselves and centering someone else.
yeah.
Right. And then, of course, there's mental health support, there's group support, there's book support. The number one thing I want to say, because it often gets left out of this conversation, is that your perpetrator, the person who harmed you, doesn't get to control your pleasure.
Mm,
They don't get to control your pleasure. The narrative you have about your body, the narrative you have about the sexual behaviors you enjoy or that you want to try, they don't get to continue to take away your pleasure ever.
mm. Now, something you said that's really interesting, and Amy said, "Wow, need some time on your therapy couch," right? Um, and some folks do see it as acceptable. So I have two questions. So
Okay.
I'll go back first. Which my first one was, you mentioned like, oh, that thing with that cousin or that thing with that other individual that someone may see as assault or may not.
Mm-hmm.
How does one deal with when it is within a family, and even more so when it's a gap between kids, right? Like, so
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's not to be malice or harmful or assault them. It's like an older kid curious with a younger kid. And like, what does a parent or anyone do in that type of situation?
Yeah. And those situations are so hard and difficult. And they're also quite normal. When we were little, we played house, right? We played doctor. It is not abnormal for, I would say, probably up to 7 year olds and down, like 4 to 7, right? Or to say, like, oh, what do other people's genitals look like? What do other people's belly buttons look like? Right? Butts are funny at that age.
Mm-hmm.
Poop and pee jokes are funny and normative. And I don't think some of those go away according to people. All right. They 12-year-olds and then 32 and 52-year-olds still make poop jokes. And
Mm-hmm.
apparently they're all still funny. So that being said, when it is between, you have to look at age range and history.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if cousin Tyrone has been doing this to all of the little kids, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's a problem the second time it happens. Right. Also, given you have to give neurodivergence a thing. So, is it somebody who is autistic, somebody who's on this, somebody who has autism? Like, what's going on there to check to see if boundaries need to be maintained and further incorporated. That means they might not have independent play. There might need to be somebody there all of the time. It might mean we need to talk about what are private places versus what's not a private place. And that's really important. So, and also, does anybody feel harmed from the situation? Because that's what's going to be the most core. If they feel harmed, if they feel like they're unsafe, if they feel like they're in danger, those are going to be the flags to say, we need to do something different here. This is not okay.
And something that I've always found interesting and really sad in family dynamics is how it seems like often, like when there is that harm or a knowledge of that harm, it's then on the victim or the potential victim to protect themselves, right? Like, don't be around that uncle, don't wear those shorts, don't do that. Like, why are we protecting this person who we know does harm instead of, I mean, not that you want to kick them out of the family, but like, why are their feelings being protected and why is everyone walking on eggshells around them instead of protecting, to me, the most important thing, which is the kids or even other adults, because assault happens at all age ranges within a family.
I mean, that's $1 million question. I don't know if there was somebody coming over my house and I had to worry about my girls like changing their clothes, that person wouldn't be coming over my house.
You would think, right?
I mean that, and that's the way, right? That's the way that's the way my community operates. The other people that I parent with, that's like my lover, my friends, their friends. We all have similar values, and I think that's super important when you're raising a family. Find other families with similar values that you can trust and be like, hey, this is how I operate. This is what I believe. Yes. And for that person, I need them to have help. And I think that's something that gets skipped over specifically for people who are attracted to minors, because not all people attracted to minors harm minors.
Yeah.
But people who are attracted to minors are attracted to minors when they're kids.
Mm.
Right? So they're 12-year-olds attracted to 7-year-olds. And then they're 15 and they're still attracted to 7-year-olds. And then they're 27 and they're still attracted to 7-year-olds. And then they're 37, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But nobody's ever gotten them help because we're too ashamed or it's too bad or we can't talk about that. We just know that they're like that. Absolutely not. They need help. They need help to prevent harm. And everybody wants to kill them off and everybody wants to send them to prison. And that doesn't work.
Right.
We know that doesn't work.
Yep.
They do need to be somewhere where they do need to, they earn consequences. They earn punishment. Absolutely. But we know that it doesn't work. But if we caught them when they were 12, when you notice that your kid is a little bit different or your kid is still attracted to playing with younger kids for some reason, get them help so they don't harm someone, so they don't hurt anyone. And it's hard things for parents to admit. It's hard thing for caregivers to admit. And once we get over our own stuff and admit like, this is weird, they might need some support, we get them the help that they need.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's wild to think of how much could be prevented if people would do that. Whether we're talking about sexual assault or violence or other things, like sometimes people are so concerned about how they'll look as a parent for having that issue, or they don't want people to think their kid is weird, when it's like, no, you need to nip this in the butt now while they're young so it doesn't become a problem. Because like you said, it isn't necessarily something that they can control. It's a part of your brain that fires off. I watched I have a thing about brain stuff. I love it. But I was watching a documentary series once, and they were talking about how there's literally sensors in your brains that light up when you see certain images that you have absolutely no control over. It's just how your brain is wired. And one of those is, and they were doing it for testing for pedophilia, but that is one of those things. Like some people really, truly don't have control over what flares up. But what you do have control over is your actions and learning the tools, just like how people with every other mental illness, behavioral, whatever, can learn how to manage it. So can people with that. But you really do, like you said, have to keep an eye on it from a young age and address it the minute you see it.
Yep. And people also forget that like 16-year-olds and 17-year-olds are still minors, but for some reason it's more okay for grown men to go after those minors. But
Yeah,
that's actually a form. It's called a phebophilia, right?
mhm,
And like it's actually a form of minor attraction that people
yeah,
are like, oh, well, they're 16, 17, they're almost no, they are
they're
still
really not.
children.
Yes. And that's why it's something I'll try not to get on my soapbox, but when people call girls fast, it drives
Oh,
me absolutely insane, especially because we all acknowledge that that is the age of hormones for boys. So I don't understand why we don't acknowledge that that is also the age of hormones for girls. But instead, girls are called fast and they're not protected when they should be just as protected. And
mhm,
any grown man or grown woman in that situation, whether it's same sex or opposite sex, because
mhm,
teenage boys, they're raging hormones. That doesn't mean that their brains know better. Your brain isn't done forming till you're like,
mhm,
what, 24, 25? Like,
right,
they don't know better. So a grown adult woman with them or a grown adult man with them is still a problem. And it's
mhm,
very frustrating to me that we say, like, oh, because their body looks a certain way and
yep,
because they're into stuff, then it's okay. Of course
right.
they're into stuff. They're raging hormones. That it's
Exactly.
the
They have the
adult
same
in that
feelings. They have the
situation.
same feelings as an adult body once they hit menstruation. They have
Yep,
the same horny feelings. And I'm known for a saying that got like went viral, and people never credit the source, but ain't no teenage girl fast enough to catch a grown man.
that part.
That's
But
not
we act
attracted to
like they are, and
children.
it's very frustrating.
It
It's very
is,
frustrating the
especially
minute like
black and
we
brown
put it.
bodies,
Yes,
especially black and brown bodies. Hmm.
yes. And that's put on them and the shame is put on them. And I think that's also though why a lot of women, you mentioned earlier, like people don't always identify as victims. And sometimes it's really because they're not or they don't feel like they are. But I
Hmm.
do also sometimes feel like it's because they can't if they like they can't acknowledge the victimness in someone else because it would mean that they would have to acknowledge that they were a victim. Like they can't
Hmm.
acknowledge the another teen being abused because then they'd have to say, oh, I was in the similar situation and that would mean that I was abused. So
Hmm.
it's easier to say like they're just fast like I was fast, but you
Hmm.
weren't fast. You were a teenager with hormones and a grown adult took advantage of you.
Yep, and we see that placed on kids, right? Oh, look how she's growing up. Her hips are spreading. She got a bubble butt. It must mean. And same with it's called adultification, if you want the really big term for it, but it's placing adult-like characteristics on children. And we find that happening for black and brown children. And boys aren't excluded here, right? So you
Right.
see that 12-year-old boy who got peach fuzz, who went through that growth spurt, and you see the teen moms lusting over him. Oh, he's such a heartbreaker. Oh,
Mhm.
you my little man, ain't you? No, no, my son is not. Absolutely, he not.
Right.
No. So yeah, so we see that all the time, and it's from birth, right? We see the shirts, we see the watch out, ladies, here I come.
Hmm.
No, absolutely not.
No. Something that you mentioned that is really interesting that I want to touch on is you said that those people who have been abused, um, the abuser doesn't like own or control their pleasure, their whatever going
Mhm.
forward. But I do know that like sometimes a lot of people, the form with which they were abused becomes the thing that is their point of attraction or their um I guess turn on buttons. Can you just like
Mm.
talk about like how that happens and why, I
Yeah,
guess?
sure. So it's not as often where the thing that the sexual behavior or whatever took place that was uncomfortable becomes the fixation point for like orgasm or peak pleasure. The thing is, the body's going to react how the body reacts. If you touch a sensory or you touch a nerve enough, it's going to react in the brain. Not that you want it to, but it's going to follow its natural body and biology. And
Mhm.
so sometimes it's like, oh, that felt really good. This touch felt really good. I actually enjoy this touch. Because you enjoy that touch doesn't mean it has to be associated with that person who harmed you,
Mm.
right? You just have more information and data on what your body actually likes. Now, if it's part of a fantasy, if it's part of a recollection, something like that, that's fine if it doesn't bother you. If it does bother you, we have a bunch of different treatment techniques to do some replacing and to do some modeling that could be helpful. But the fixation on it, some people have it as part of their fantasy play. Some people don't. And it's not as popular to be like, well, this is the thing that gets me off because this is what happened here. It's sometimes a way that the body is conditioned. So if you masturbate all the time on your back with your knees up, and that's the only way you masturbate and you know how to get to orgasm, then your body's going to be more inclined to get to an orgasm easier if you're on your back with your knees up.
Mm.
And so sometimes when you're first learning your body and you learn, like, if I do this thing this way, it gives me pleasure, you condition your body to get pleasure easiest in that way. And sometimes that's what it looks like. because you haven't explored other routes of pleasure because you might not know them yet.
That makes a lot of sense. When we talk about, sexual assault and some of the trauma that leads to, like, can you just sort of like the intersection between trauma therapy and sexual health counseling, especially for survivors?
Hmm. So, when there's trauma at play and trauma that gets triggered, trauma that you're living with, we know that the sexual health determinants, big words for the outcomes of all of that, can be detrimental. It can lead to depression, it can lead to anxiety, social isolation. You don't want to be around people, self esteem issues. And when you have self esteem issues, sometimes you're more likely to be taken advantage of. Sometimes you're less likely to use protective measures in sexuality, birth control, condoms, external or internal, not engaging in dangerous sexual play. So everybody you meet should not be a person that chokes you, even though you might like choke sex, because they don't know that you're supposed to choke from the sides and not the front. And 15 seconds without oxygen, and you can have brain damage. So, right? So they might have behaviors that are more unsafe and push the brink for that, not safe wording if they're in a kink scene. So when people are having trauma, they might even be numbed out. They might not be able to feel pleasure at all because they're in that trauma narrative. They're completely checked out. We call it spectatoring, when you kind of step outside yourself and you can watch yourself doing something, that disassociation that's happening. And so they're not feeling very fulfilled in their sexual pleasure. And so we see that happen a lot. And when we're talking about therapy, we work on somatics, getting back into your body, taking control and relinquishing power when you want to. We talk about what it might mean to just live in fantasy, or if it's something that we want to come into fruition. And then, of course, the safer ways to do this. So we have less sexually transmitted infections. So we have less unwanted potential pregnancies. So we have less engagements with people that are less desirable than we would typically like.
That makes a lot of sense. I would assume when you're dealing with helping people with a sexual assault prevention or a response afterwards, that, sort of a cultural beliefs and society norms and gender things kind of play a role in those. Like, how do you address that with your practice when you're working with people?
Yeah, absolutely. So for sexual assault prevention, we work with the people who might assault people,
That's
right?
a good thing.
One, start there. So that means teaching everybody about consent, even married people.
Mm.
Just because you married a person doesn't mean that they own your body. Marital rape is a thing. Marital sexual assault is a thing. And it can happen and it exists. And just because you took your vows in front of whatever God you believe in does not mean that this person has a right to use your body for their pleasure.
Mhm.
So that's one for sexual assault prevention. On the other side, when we're working with people who are surviving sexual assault, have been victims of sexual assault, we oftentimes work with grounding. So being present in the room, in the body, instead of floating somewhere else, getting away from it. Being able sometimes to ground with your partner. So sometimes we do deep breathing or tantric breathing. Sometimes we have an object. So your wedding ring, maybe, to remind you that this is a person who loves you and cares for you and will stop when you ask, and we'll check in with you. Sometimes we do some scripting, giving them actual words and things. And sometimes it's taking sex completely off the table to relieve pressure, to say, like, no, you don't have to do this. It's not fun. It's only building resentment. How about we stop for a while? And couples get mad at me, and that's fine. I'm okay. This is not a nice conversation. You don't pay me to have breakfast with you. You pay
Right.
me to help you. So you can be mad. Be mad. No, you don't get to have sex for 2 weeks. So so we do a variety of things in the office to try and help support people. So if their goal is to get to sexual pleasure, if their goal is to relinquish some of that, there's other therapy techniques. There's talk therapy, there's EMDR, there's CBT. I tend to be emotion focused, especially for Black and Brown and queer folks, because we're not taught that we're able to emote. We're taught that our feelings are dangerous. Angry Black woman tropes,
Yeah.
existing in a Black or brown body, feelings, you're not supposed to have them, or you're not supposed to show them. You're just supposed to be okay. Meanwhile, we feel like we're suffocating and drowning
Mm-hmm.
because we're supposed to be so super. You don't have to be a superwoman in my office.
Yeah. Which
Matter of
I
fact,
think
I
is
pretty
so
much don't
important.
allow it.
Yeah. And it's good to have that space to be vulnerable and to talk about those things.
Mhm.
Um, We talked a little bit, I think we've touched on a couple of them, but what are some common like myths and misconceptions around sexual assault that you find?
Oh, that it's their fault, right? Whoever got sexually assaulted, what was she wearing? She was leading them on. How many drinks did she have? Was she high? Right? Oh, she really wanted it. If she didn't really want it, right? So those are those myths that are trash. And
Right?
absolutely. And that's the thing about consent. It's always reversible. I don't care if we buck naked in the middle of the bed and I'm about to straddle you. If I still say no, I'm good. The answer
Hmm.
is no.
Exactly. I've
That's
never
it.
understood why people like, especially the argument of like, well, they knew what they were doing. Like, why did they go there with them? Or like, maybe at the time they thought they wanted to. Maybe they were feeling big and bad or big and horny, and they're like, yes, let's do this. And then they got there and they're like, never mind. Like, you have a right to say no at any point. Even like you said, you can say no in the middle of it. Like, I'm not feeling this. Like, we could stop. So the
Get off
argument
me.
that someone knew what they were getting into and that's why it's okay that they got assaulted is beyond, like Izzy said, it's straight trash. Like no is
Hmm.
no. It's beyond trash to me.
Exactly, exactly. And no doesn't mean let me wear them down till they say
Yeah.
yes. That's
Yeah.
coercion. It's still a no. Take your no and move forward. So that's, I think those are some of the common stereotypes, right? The other thing is that people who are surviving sexual assault are broken.
Mm.
They think they're either whorish, like, oh, that's just a hoe, something had to happen to her because she likes a lot of sex and like they're just gobbling up all of the sex.
Mm.
Or they're super pious, like they might be a prude, they can't be sexually free or freaky, or they're just only super vanilla. They can't take control of sexual things, and that's not necessarily true either. So lots of myths, lots of stereotypes that get placed on survivors, and that like they're damaged goods and they're super fragile, and that's not necessarily true either.
And I feel like it's so hard, like having these conversations. I think sometimes because people don't want to talk about it, even though they should. And I was telling someone earlier today, like I feel that I didn't realize how naive I was sometimes to certain situations because I really thought when Me Too happened, there'd be like this cultural shift. Like I thought, aha,
Mhm.
now everyone will see that almost everyone they know has had like some type of like assault or harassment or something, and like eyes will open and people will be like, let's be better. And that did not happen. And people still make all the excuses for why it's always the victim fault. And it's actually quite disappointing, especially
Yeah.
when the numbers show that so many women are impacted by
Mhm.
this or have been hurt by it.
Yep, and so many men too, right? It's one out of six
Yeah.
men,
Yep.
right? And it would be more if we didn't have the machismo kind of stereotype. There were just a bunch of teachers accused of sexually assaulting their students who were
Mhm.
young teenage boys.
Yeah.
So that being said, also this whole if you were in the woods and saw a man or a bear, like which one would you be a more like
I
which
saw
one
that.
would you want to see is what's
Mhm.
been going around, and like women are saying the bear. And like a lot of men are offended of like, well, why would you rather see a bear? And it was like, because the worst the bear can do is kill me.
That part, that part. But
Right.
what's so frustrating is like they're offended instead of being like, how can we make this better? How can we change? How can we hold each other accountable? Because men aren't blind to it. And I think that they do know, but there's something that stops them, I guess, from calling each other out or holding them each other to a higher standard, whether it's sexual abuse or just abuse. And it's disappointing.
And I think there's communities of men who are doing that accountability work and doing their own internal work to undo some of these things that they've been taught too. And
Yeah.
don't skate sleep. They've been taught it by women as well. Right?
Yes.
They've been taught by other women that this is how they're supposed to treat women and girls and be in competition and to exert their dominance and power because women and girls like it.
Hmm.
So it's insidious. It has been passed down. It is a transgenerational trauma
Hmm.
that is belief and happening all over. But absolutely, it needs to have more accountability. We need to have more eyes and ears on it
Yeah.
because it's more popular than we think.
It is. And especially like that whole, and I don't know why the narrative is pushed so hard that like no means yes and like no means try harder. And especially, not to tell myself too much, but I grew up very like Christian, very like religious or whatever. So the need to be the good girl is very important, right? So
Hmm.
And good girls don't give in right away. You say like, no, like we shouldn't. And then they
Mhm.
like kind of convince you and they're like, okay. And I mean, carry that into like adulthood. But it's just like, I remember the first time I had a partner who was like, okay, like the minute I said no. And I was like, wait, isn't this the part where you convinced me? Like, what's happening?
Mhm. Mhm.
And then I
Yeah.
realized, like, oh no, that's how they're supposed to respond.
Mhm.
Like this whole teaching people that they should say no and convince them because we really do. And especially in media, I was watching that movie with Jennifer Lopez, like the boy next door or something. Like she said
Mhm.
no probably like 50 times through the beginning of them hooking up, but it's seen as foreplay instead of teaching people like
Mm.
no means no and you should stop. And I feel like that's also part of why the rates are so high for assault and abuse at the college level because you take
Mhm.
that growing up with the knowledge that no means yes or no means I should convince you, then you add in alcohol and it's just it's a mess. And I wish really that we would stop that we would stop pushing that
Absolutely.
narrative of no means yes.
Absolutely. There's the Fries model from Planned Parenthood that talks about consent, right? So freely given, reversible, and it goes through all FRIES. You can look it up. But they have this model of saying, like, no, like consent has a lot of basis. It's enthusiastic, right? And we don't teach enough people about that. And on college campuses, yes, add alcohol, add horny feelings, and then add lack of sex education.
Yeah.
Sex education just it doesn't teach people specifically how to have intercourse. Sex education teaches people how to navigate relationships, how to
Mm-hmm.
navigate saying no. We like literally in the curriculum for high schoolers, it says, how do you say no to a friend? What does that feel like? What's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
So sex ed, and I think sex ed is only non-abstinence only and required to be medically accurate in 17 states in the United States.
Yeah, it's a problem.
And
It's
it's
a,
being
and like
repealed,
it's
right?
being
Because
repealed
people
in
are upset
other
about
places
it.
too. We need more of it, not less of it. Like it drives
Exactly.
me insane, and especially because it's like it's proven that sex education helps prevent things like unplanned pregnancies
Mhm.
and sexual assaults. Like the states with the least amount of sex education have the highest rates of teen pregnancies. Like, so I don't think
And
the whole
almost 40% of teen
not
pregnancies are
working.
by adult men,
Yeah, that part too. So it's just
by the way.
I get very let me namaste myself.
I
I just
understand. Yes,
it's so
yes.
frustrating when there are like facts, right? It's not like, oh, I wonder. It's like, no, here are the numbers that are telling
Mhm.
you this. And you're choosing to not address it. You're choosing to address this make believe world where if we don't talk about it, it's not going to
It
happen
goes
when all
away.
you're doing is making things worse by not talking about it.
And that's why I bring up shame-free sex ed, right? Because shame tells you that you're bad and you're unlovable. If I shame you, I make you feel worthless.
Mm-hmm.
And so many people who are surviving that trauma of having sexual assault in some way, shape, or form, of having childhood sexual abuse, feel like they're unlovable. And when we feel unlovable, we do desperate things to be wanted,
Yeah.
things that harm ourselves, that harm our self esteem, that harm our bodies. And not everybody who has been sexually assaulted has survived. And it's so important to realize that you have survived something. You may have survived it by the skin of your teeth. You may feel like you were holding on by an absolute thread, but you have survived. You might be breathing right on schedule, and that's all you can do, and that's okay. But you're survived. Some
Mm-hmm.
people don't.
Yeah, that's very true. And as you said, I've noticed that there's been a transparency in male public figures about sexual abuse. This is wonderful as it encourages people to share their story,
Mhm.
which is absolutely true. Because, I mean, even knowing that, like you said, 1 in 6 men, and knowing that men are impacted, we still revert our minds to the women.
Mhm.
And men are impacted, and they do need to feel like they have that space to talk about it.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
Godbride said yes, thank you, and said shame-free sex education is important. And as he said, you have survived and you are loved, which is
Mhm.
so important to know. And just speaking of survivors, like how can survivors navigate that feeling of like shame and guilt that often arise after the experience?
Absolutely. So after the experience, it's going to be a wash, right? You're in shell shock. There's going to be infuriation. There's going to be grief and the cycles of grief, of anger and begging and pleading, and eventually maybe an acceptance of like, this happened to me and who am I now? So you need community because we heal with community. Now, look, I'm not saying you need 50, 11 people. I'm saying maybe one or two folks, okay? Maybe five, depending on what you need. You need to figure out what you want to do. Some people don't want to go to police. Some people want to go to police. Some people want to go to a hospital and get rape kits done. Some people do not. You figure out what you want, and then you get the people that are going to help you do it.
Mhm.
And those
And
are going to be your people.
and for those who have a family or friend, I think that that's also a hard thing. Like, how, like, do you talk about it with them? Do you not talk about it with them? Like, what are some ways that you can support a family or friend who you know has been through sexual assault?
Yeah, there is a book, I can't remember the name of it, where it's like all of these different animals who come to help console this kid. And one's like, an angry elephant, like, F all this, I'll knock all this shit over. What we doing? Let's destroy it. Now, look, sometimes I'm that friend too. I'm like, we flipping tables? Like, what's
Right.
going on? I also grew up as I'm a Baptist. I'm a recovering Baptist now.
Mhm.
So, like, Jesus flipped tables in the Bible we had to read and crack whips. So, that being said, the last animal that was a bunny who just sat next to them and was quiet. Like, I think sometimes the way you listen and hear can be your greatest asset. So I'm going to be real quiet right next to you. And if you need to cry and use me as a tissue, you can. If you want me to rage with you, you can. If we want to dance it out of our bodies, we can. But again, I'm not centering my feelings, I'm centering yours.
Mhm.
Who's going to be the friend that has enough ability to make some room for you? If it's not a friend, there's the RAIN hotline. There's a War, Women Organized Against Rape. There are a bunch of different hotlines you can call that have a trained professional on the other end to help you sort through those really, really hard feelings, those really, really dark feelings, those really, really secretive feelings. There are also groups that you can go to. There's bibliotherapy. You can read stuff. Emily Nagoski's book. I would skip The Body Keeps Score. And instead, there's one other book by you that I really, really like. What My Bones Know is really
Mhm.
good. And so you can read from other people who've been in similar situations
Mhm.
to know that you're not in this alone. You're not in this alone.
Yeah. Well, that's wonderful. And you actually answered my next question, which was going to be like, what are some resources and networks that people can reach out to, some survivors and family friends? And I think that those are some really great ones that you listed. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for having this conversation with me. I know that it's your wheelhouse, but I know that sometimes it's one of those topics that makes people uncomfortable. But I feel like those are the topics we really need to talk about because you can't just pretend like it doesn't exist and hope, because all that leads to is you having to deal with the aftermath of it when you could have felt uncomfortable before and learned how to prevent it. So I think
Mm.
it's really important to have these conversations. So I can't thank you enough for your time.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I think this is such a great conversation. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, like, is there anything else, like any last points that you would want to either tell parents or adults or anything as far as just navigating these waters?
Yeah, I just want to remind people that pleasure isn't specifically sexual, right?
Mm,
So we say pleasure, and people often just think of genital pleasure, but there's pleasure in dance, there's pleasure in food, there's pleasure in books, there's pleasure in snuggling, there's pleasures in hot showers, there's pleasures in having somebody scratch a scalp. And I think all people, no matter their age, deserve pleasure, right? So being a Southerner, I was to be seen and not always heard. But there's pleasure in being able to use your voice, and you have all of the pleasure access, and that's really, really important.
absolutely. And Godred, which was leading to my next question, which is perfect, is do you have a web page? And yes, like how can people find you? How can they reach out to you?
Oh, absolutely. So I would probably go through my Instagram. The block was hot with some people again being mad and considering me a groomer, and sometimes those people are very, very scary,
Mm,
and a lot of death threats. So I'm still navigating some of that. So to be
yeah.
safe, send me a DM. It'll go in my request, and then I can let you onto my Instagram page. There's a bunch of videos and some homework for lovers to reconnect there as well. So yeah, and then also my website is Lexx Lexx sex sex doc.com. And so those are the two places that you can find me: Instagram and lexsexdoc.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much for joining me. Thank you, everybody who's tuned in from home with your comments and interaction. We appreciate it. This is the last Thursday of April. Next month, next Thursday is the first April. Oh my goodness. Next Thursday is the first Thursday in May, which is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we'll be, even though we talk about mental health all the time here at What's on Your Mind, we're really going to focus in on a few mental health related topics, starting with dealing with grief. So join us next week while we have a conversation about resiliency and dealing with grief and its impact on you. So thank you again for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.